Hi, I'm Anjali Alappat, the host of Arcx, a series about literary inspiration. I have loved fantasy and science fiction for as long as I can remember. In these strange times, these stories are a wonderful form of escape, doorways to different worlds, offering glimpses into possible futures. In Season 2, I'm going to be talking to 8 South Asian fantasy, sci-fi, and speculative fiction writers to find out what really made them want to tell stories. We're going to talk about books, movies, TV shows, video games, and other media that shaped and influenced them as writers. Today we chat with short story writer, novelist, and editor Vajra Chandrasekera. His short fiction has been nominated for the Theodore Sturgeon Memorial Award. He was also part of the editorial team at Strange Horizons magazine when they won numerous awards, including the British Fantasy Award for Best Magazine. Vajra's first novel, The Saint of Bright Doors, is out in July 2023. We discuss some classic Desi themes: colonialism, intergenerational trauma, and overblown family drama. We also touch on destiny, friendships, revolution, and terrible science fiction adaptations. You can follow Vajra on Twitter @_Vajra. Hi, Vajra. Thank you for joining us today on Arcx.
Thank you for having me.
Just to kind of get started, I wanted to ask you about your journey as a writer. How did you get started? Did you always want to be one?
Yeah, I think so. My earliest memory of writing any kind of fiction is from, I think, the age of 9 or so, 9 or 10. Short stories mostly. My father was a writer, so there was something of an expectation, I think, when I was growing up, that like his children were naturally expected to grow up as writers or artists of some kind. It was just like what you did. I didn't actually start writing for publication until much later, obviously, but it was always kind of in the back of my head as an aspiration, if not an ambition necessarily.
That's really amazing because I didn't realize your dad was a writer as well.
His name was Vajra Chandrasekera. He was a novelist and short story writer in Sinhala, in Sri Lanka, in the late 70s and 80s mostly. He kept writing through to the early 2000s. He died in 2009. So his first book was published in 1979, the same year I was born. In fact, as far as I know, he wrote it like in the first few months after I was born or during my mother's pregnancy, possibly, because it came out in December and I was born in August. So after that, I think like his most successful work was probably a short story collection in the early 80s, which won a state literary award in Sri Lanka. And after that, there was a series of novels, most of which I think could describe as autofiction. He grew up in a village in the northwest of Sri Lanka in the 1940s. By the time he was writing it, it was already a very different world to his readers. So I think there's a lot of, we call it nostalgia, and a lot of tracing this post-colonial history of Sri Lanka from a rural school through to a school in Colombo, through to the first university in Sri Lanka, so like Peradeniya, through to his early years in the civil service. Kind of a very classic post-colonial work of what it was like in this time of tremendous change. Most of the work is before I was born. It's his life story from the 1940s through to the 1970s, approximately. But it's interesting because the publishing in Sri Lanka in the 70s and 80s was very much what we would now call self-publishing, right? So the books were published at home. There was press like in the town where we grew up with the actual printing, but the proofing, the copy editing, even eventually the typesetting was done at home. Like he bought one of those letterpress type setup. The whole family was recruited. My mother was his editor. My brother did the covers. And I, at the tender age of like, 10 to 12, was proofreading my father's novels in Sinhala so that he could fix it by hand on his letterpress like setup. So I was very kind of like immersed in this literary atmosphere, I guess, in this very publishing industry in miniature, and I go to his book launch events, that sort of thing.
And other than your father, were there any books or, media that really influenced your storytelling?
For me, the big influence was obviously speculative fiction, science fiction, which in Sri Lanka and at that time mostly meant things like Arthur C. Clarke and whatnot. And I think a little later, like fantasy, Tolkien, that sort of thing. I think that the biggest influences for me happened in the 90s with books like Michael Swanwick's The Iron Dragon's Daughter, Jeff Noon's Vert, that sort of thing. So a kind of modern urban fantasy that is very, and of course the cyberpunk era, Gibson, Sterling, all that sort of thing. I read as much of this stuff as I could find, which was not a whole lot, but the British Council stocked like a fair amount of it.
It's so interesting because I think it all comes down to access, right?
Yeah.
Most of us, I suppose, got our access through libraries and that kind of thing. And I think it's underestimated how that shapes you as a writer and as a reader, because you don't really have much of a choice. You're working with what you have. And which is why I think pretty much everyone who's come on Arcx has referenced Tolkien, because that was what we had.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Clark and Asimov. Any other particular books that kind of stood the test of time for you?
Yeah, I mean, tons. I wouldn't even count Clark and Asimov as particular favorites or anything of the sort. It's just that they were by far the most available, the most accessible. So they were my introduction to a lot of this kind of thing. In fact, when I was 12, I really thought Asimov was this great writer of prose for some reason, and everyone made fun of me for this. It took me years to actually get over and read more books. I think writers like Swanwick were my actual introduction to actually good prose and in fantasy. Solaris, obviously, Stanislaw Lem. Philip K. Dick. I was a huge fan of Philip K. Dick. I still am. I think among the science fiction writers, I mostly enjoyed cyberpunk and post-cyberpunk era. I would have enjoyed John Arras and Samuel Delaney and so on at a younger age if I had managed to find their books, but I did not. So I actually only counted them in my 20s. I read some very contemporary books in the 90s, but also some very classic books, and skipped over a whole bunch in the middle because I think a lot of 70s speculative fiction was less available than either the 80s or the 60s. The question of influences is so strange because when you ask me about it outright, my mind goes entirely blank. I've never read a book. I don't remember any books.
Okay, no, the thing that I wanted to come back to was Philip K. Dick. And I fell deeply in love with Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, because I think it was the first thing that I had read, which was, to me, comically absurd.
Yeah, it's a very funny book.
I feel like a lot of people I've talked to about this book didn't have the same reaction, because it is a slightly torturous situation and there's a moral quandary and there's a lot to say about empathy and humanity and stuff like that. But I couldn't stop laughing about the damn sheep.
Philip K. Dick is a very funny writer, but I think one of the problems with androids is Blade Runner, which is not funny at all, and it's very dour. I really hate those films because, for example, at the very opening of Android, you find out that Deckard is wearing this lead codpiece because of the radioactive fallout dust or whatever. So everyone, all the men in the story are wearing lead codpieces. And just imagine Harrison Ford in a giant lead codpiece wandering through this. I think that would give the whole film a very different tenor. Dick often does this. He undercuts the severity of the situations with comic, like the elevator that demands money to let the narrator, go downstairs, or the whole thing with electric sheep and the constant keeping up with the Joneses of having an electric animal. How much of this book is really about, or the Deckards as a couple, status anxieties about having a living animal instead of an electric one, and how much things cost. Just literally being able to afford an animal, which is completely absent in the film. He's not even married in the film, as far as I know. There's no wife, and the wife, Iran Deckard, is such a huge part of the book. So, yeah, the extrication, the removal of the humor from Philip K. Dick really turns it into something else, and that's something that I think film adaptations do constantly. They make it very dark and gritty and miserable. I think the filmic impression of Philip K. Dick is completely different from what we understand of him from the books. And Androids is probably the starkest example of that.
I agree. And I think it's so essential to even moving across this kind of absurd plot, right? Because it all begins with this concept of having this, I say exotic in air quotes, animal. And the whole time when everything else in his life is falling apart, he's still kind of holding on to this hope of buying. What was the other animal in between? He goes and tries to buy one, and
I think it was an ostrich.
Yes, and it was so insane to me because I was like, okay, a sheep I kind of understand, but the ostrich?
And I love that he's constantly carrying around the book, Sydney's, which is the catalog of how much animals cost. Every time he meets an animal, he pulls the book out and he leafs to the page and he's like, yes, ostriches, they cost this much. I can't afford that.
Exactly. The rest of the plot is extremely grim.
And I mean, there are points where you both love and hate him as a character. And I think also, you both pity and revile these androids as well. So this is kind of necessary. Otherwise, it's just really bleak. But a lot of science fiction is like that, I think.
Yeah, some writers are really good at incorporating humor into books that are not like comedies. But I think Philip K. Dick is one of my favorite authors who do this thing. The whole book is it's sad but funny. It's tragicomic, but the comic elements come to the fore in a way that foregrounds the cod pieces. This story is about, well, among other things, about eugenics and slavery, right? Which is one of the broad themes of so about fertility and the loss of fertility and the insecurities that accompany the loss of fertility and of being replaced by these androids who don't have such fears. And of course, even the big plot reveals, like when the androids reveal, for example, that Mercer is a fake, but literally no one cares, right? It affects nobody. The androids are very smug about this because they're like, okay, we've fact-checked your religion and it's fake. We've literally found the actor who's playing your Messiah. And the humans are like, fine, it's an actor. But like, nevertheless, we're going to continue having religious epiphanies and framing everything in the context of Mercerism and that is actually very true to life, because that is what happens when you fact check things that are not based in facticity in any meaningful way. That's also one of the fundamental themes of the book, right? What is fake? It's actually one of, I think, Dick's fundamental themes in all of his books. But yeah, the sheep is fake. The toad at the end is fake. Mercer is fake. And the whole question about are androids fake people or not? And really, they're only fake because there's a test to determine whether they're fake or not, and because they're intentionally designed to fail this test. So essentially, the whole thing is they're fake because people like Descartes are going to shoot them based on arbitrary tests that essentially means a lot less than it's supposed to. The test itself keeps getting obsoleted and it keeps coming up with new tests, new and more stringent tests each time an android demonstrates that they're capable of something that they were not supposed to be capable of.
It is a little bit like moving the goalposts every time there's any kind of advancement. So it's very clear that they're never going to be considered anything but second-rate citizens, if that. And I mean, which is a depressing thought, but you can also kind of see that it is kind of indoctrination, right? Because people like Deckard aren't necessarily happy doing this, but at the same time feel like if they don't do it, the consequences are going to be terrible because they've been indoctrinated with this idea that androids are going to come after them or whatever. They're the boogeyman, basically.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know if this was intended this way, but I read it very much as a slavery narrative. So Deckard is the classic policeman in the sense that he's a hunter of escaped slaves, which is how I believe the police were invented originally in the first place in the real world. But the idea that you can separate out a group of humans and then continually deny them access to full humanity and full citizenship based on any number of arbitrary tests, and then violently enforce that separation by having someone essentially shoot you or imprison you if you happen to cross the boundary. In fact, the book actually does explicitly make this connection, because I remember somewhere in the early part of the book, one of the many advertisements inviting the last few people left on Earth to emigrate. One of the selling points is you get an android, quote unquote, servant of your own. And it explicitly says something about it recreating the American South in the pre-Civil War. The book is quite blunt about the connection. And ironically, the androids escaping their slave labor conditions in the colonies come back to Earth, whereas the humans on Earth are trying to get out to the colonies so that they can live like slave owners at leisure. So the book is much more sympathetic to the androids in that sense than I think any of the film adaptations have been, really.
But what do you think you've drawn from this book in perhaps your own work? Is there anything that you feel like you've taken away from it?
From Dick in general, I think my biggest kind of takeaway as a writer was the idea that Dick was very clearly a writer who had a project, right? An aesthetic project, a philosophical project. He had questions about what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be authentic? What are the boundaries of the real, the fake? Can you tell when, the one is replaced by the other? What does it even mean? to have like those kinds of tests of authenticity. I felt that it gave me permission to have questions, I guess, to have bigger questions, to write books that were not simply, entertainments. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but to have ambition, I guess, as an artist, to ask bigger questions and to explore questions and to be okay with the idea that there are some questions that you're going to be grappling with for your entire life, your career as an artist. But that was my biggest takeaway. The other was like the willingness to be funny, I think, of the willingness to not take yourself too seriously, to be able to undercut yourself, to make jokes in the text, to be playful. He's not afraid to ask big questions and also like do really dumb jokes. Like, haha, this guy's wearing a big codpiece. At the same time, which I think like a lesser writer would struggle with pulling that off.
I also obviously want to talk about your own book, your debut novel, The Saint of Bright Doors. And before we jump into that, I want to invite you to summarize it a bit for our listeners who perhaps haven't read the stuff that has been released just yet because the book is not out, and also to do a short reading.
Yes. Okay, so The Saint of Bright Doors. It's my debut novel. It's a fantasy novel for adults, which will be out July 11th as of this recording, though I think this episode will be out well after that. So in a sense, I'm speaking to you now from a lost past across an unbridgeable gulf, which is kind of what the book is about. It's about histories, their immensity, the way they can be manipulated, weaponized, even inhabited. The story follows this young man, Fetter, who is attempting to at least survive the conflicting expectations and destinies put upon him by his violently estranged parents and the lives that they each have in mind for him, which I think also makes this my very conventional South Asian debut novel of intergenerational trauma. Which I always promised myself I would not write that book, but I guess I did. It's just that mine is a fantasy novel, so it also includes a lot of devils and exorcisms and doors that may or may not lead to other worlds.
That's a great summary, and you said it, not me. I actually learn a lot about the book from the way the author describes it, which is often very different from the way the blurb describes it. It's nice to hear your take on it. And now you're going to do a bit of a reading.
Oh, yes, I shall do a reading from, let's see, chapter 8. When the ringing starts, Fetter mistakes it for birdsong, the trilling of some distant, insistent creature. He is at home, taking a break from research by burying himself in a book, as he often does in the afternoons when it's too warm to go outside and squat on hot concrete in direct sunlight. The trilling in the background is persistent. It's a telephone. Not his mobile phone, which lies quiet on the table next to him, but a landline. Does his apartment have a landline? He vaguely remembers seeing a receiver when he first moved in. He hunts for it. The apartment is full of books and dust. He has far more books than he has been able to read, stacked into unsteady towers, often collapsing into piles that he hasn't restacked yet. Many of the newer piles concern the bright doors, though as Cole warned him, most of them are full of nothing but speculation. Some of the oldest piles are novels, a form he was briefly fascinated by when he first came here. The trilling sound is coming from beneath such a pile. Fetter brushes aside dusty paperbacks with lurid covers, partially nude human figures clutching weapons and each other against the sun or the sea or against monstrous being. At the bottom is a telephone with a rotary dial, plastic once shiny and blue, now dull and discolored. It is ringing, but when Fetter picks it up and speaks into it, there is nothing to be heard on the other side, only the pure silence of disconnection. The landline is not plugged in. When he replaces the receiver, it starts to trill again. Filled with foreboding, he finds the connecting cable, plugs it in, and tries again. This time there is static, which resolves into his mother's voice. It's been years since he heard her, but her rasp rolls those years back like the tide. "I'm dying," Mother Florey says. Perhaps the phone has made her sound thin and scratchy, or perhaps she's always sounded like that and he's only now hearing it with adult ears. It makes his throat itch. How did you get this number? Feta asks. I divined it in the entrails, Mother of Glory says. Feta wants to ask whose entrails, but she's already saying something more. It was lost in a burst of static, but it was probably her answer to that very question. He doesn't want to ask her to repeat herself, in case the answer is vile. How are you dying? He says instead. What does that mean? The doctors, Mother of Glory says. And Feta has a vivid memory of Akustabi doctors, their mouths red from beetle black instruments in their hands. The doctors will tell you it was cancer. But it isn't? The doctors will tell you it was cancer, she repeats, as if she's practiced this line to herself in a mirror and is determined to get it out before she hangs up. But it's disappointment in you.
That might be the most South Asian part of the book.
I know, I thought it would be appropriate for the podcast.
First off, congratulations on a stunning debut. I wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed the book. It was truly gorgeous and actually a kind of effortless read. I was really sucked in. And I saw on Twitter that someone said it was so good they wanted to break their Kindle over their knee. And I strongly identified with that.
I don't think I saw that one.
I saw it and I was like, yes, screenshot. That is how I feel. So the first thing I always want to kind of delve into is the world building. And this is a pretty complex world with a lot of recognizable elements. How did you get started with it? How did, the bright doors come into being?
Well, I think in a way, this is my response to this whole problem of world building. I've written about this, I think, like in essays and so forth. I don't think about world building as world building in a sense. And I don't really think in terms of secondary worlds or other worlds as such. I try to think in terms of settings, in terms of the world, our world, which is, as far as I'm concerned, there is only one world. It's this one. And everything is about that. Sometimes it's distorted. It's changed, sometimes beyond recognition. But every book is written by an author in this world. And that means everything we know, everything on the page comes from something that is ultimately rooted in the real world, right? So for me, the bright doors are kind of a way of saying that we're all familiar with portal fantasies, right? So one of the classic types of fantasy novel where there is a door, you go through the door and there's another magical world on the other side. Without spoilers, I can say that these are not that. These are kind of that, but they're also not that. As you said, so much of this is recognizable, I think, especially to anyone from this part of the world, South Asia, because I put so much of South Asian history, culture, and, well, either history or mythology, depending on how you look at it. So for me, this was an attempt to tell this story with the freedom that comes from a lack of constraint, is how I think about fantasy, I think. Because there are absolutely conventional, realist versions of this novel that could be written, but they would be written very differently, right? Because even the word realist is complicated in some ways. In some ways, it's more realistic to put your demons on the page than to have them be implicit.
It makes a lot of sense. And I think there are a lot of parallels between worlds. I say that in air quotes also. And one of them that I was very fascinated by, which I think appears in the book, is colonialism and the spread of religion as a form of a subjugation. It's a tale as old as time, right? Like you see it everywhere. And in this particular case, I was reminded very much of the Spaniards hopping over and kind of taking over things. And I don't know if that was really the inspiration behind it, but I wanted to ask about it. And could you tell us a bit more about why that was important to the story as well?
Yeah. Essentially, borrowing a lot of existing South Asian history and kind of twisting it out of shape to tell my story. Religion is arguably the single biggest theme of the book, right? It's, in the first place, Feta's father is the founder of a religion. But also, as we go through the book is full of other stories, which you probably noticed. So it's a story of stories, which is my favorite form of story. So as we go through the book, we learn about all kinds of other historical moments other than the one the main narrative is in, including, I think, the point at which that religion was first designed and invented, but also about that religion's struggle and competition with other religions, other belief systems in the world, part of which is, yes, about colonialism, but it's also about I think even in South Asia, this is complicated, right? Because, yeah, like Sri Lanka, for example, has multiple colonial histories with Portuguese and Dutch and British colonial periods. The Spaniards didn't get to us. Neither did the French. Almost got to us, but not quite. For the book, I wanted this sense of layers, of like things built on cultures and religions and belief systems and like archaeologies built on top of each other, like the endless kind of like layering of histories. The story is in many ways about Fetter's struggle against his father's religion, but not about religion in general, but this particular religion and its evangelization and its own form of colonialism, which is, I think, something that we struggle with, South Asia struggles with in the post-colonial era, is the way that Buddhism and Hinduism, for example, have developed this kind of hegemonic power, the use of what I can only describe as colonial tools of religious suppression against religious minorities in the present day. So post-colonial reiteration of the violence of colonial times. The actors have changed, but the violence is the same, right? So that's kind of what I mean by layering as well. Because, for example, in Sri Lanka, there is this sort of cod anti-colonial discourse, this kind of like superficially progressive language that some people use, some very right-wing actors use to argue against Western interference, quote unquote, Christianity's influence, and so on and so forth. But they're using this language in support of Buddhist hegemony, of Buddhist colonization of areas which are not traditionally, quote unquote, traditionally Buddhist. And that itself is like complicated because post-colonial Sri Lanka has invented this kind of fake history where Buddhism is inherently Sinhalese. So the discovery of Buddhist relics or artifacts in areas which are now predominantly seen as Tamil areas, quote unquote, seen as an excuse to claim an authentic Sinhala history or Sinhala ownership of those areas, leading to colonization in the present day. Whereas the history that those artifacts actually point to is the idea is completely divorced from, for example, many of the great Buddhist scholars of like previous centuries were what, from present perspectives of racialization, Tamil, not Sinhalese, right? So these histories are highly contested and highly controversial. I don't think they would be controversial to any serious scholar of the subject, but these are not scholarly debates, right? These are political debates in the present day. So this is kind of the backdrop in which I grew up, right? People always talk about how fantasy novels have complex world building, but in actual fact, most fantasy novels do not have complex world building. Their world building is highly simplified, right? Because there's, I think, a drive to make the fantasy world explainable. And the one thing we know about our world is that our world is irredeemably complex. It's so complex that no one person can possibly be said to understand the real world in all its complexity, right? So the world is immeasurably complex. And I wanted a sense of that immeasurably complex on the page, where I don't set out to try to explain this world, because I thought the best way I can write this world is to write a world that at least points at, it can't depict it, but it points at that kind of complexity. Fetter doesn't understand his world, neither does anyone else in it. They understand different parts of it, maybe, just like we do in ours. But there is no possibility of like an encyclopedia of this world, at least of no encyclopedia that is less contested than the encyclopedias of the real world, which are also documents of colonialism and hegemony and misinformation for the most part, right? So that's what history and history making looks like in the real world, right? It's violent, it's contested, it's to this day full of erasures and lies and theft, basically. There should be an attempt, I think, to meet the world where it is, or at least try not to simplify it to a point where it becomes cartoonish. So that's what I've tried to do here.
Thank you. I think that's a very thoughtful answer because, as you said, it is violent, it is theft, and it's refreshing to see it played out as it is in a book. I also really enjoyed Fetter's character, his shifting origin story, his slightly naive way of moving through the world. In a lot of ways, he is kind of childlike, even though he left home so early and he's had this very torturous, from the sounds of it, childhood. Could you tell us a bit about what inspired his character and his mannerisms? Because he is not what I would say the typical chosen one would be.
Yeah, because he isn't, right? You'll have noticed the second chapter. That would have been the chapter where his adolescence went. And I was like, no, I'm not going to do that because, first of all, this is not a YA novel. And like, there's a danger of being misread if you follow his whole life story from childhood. The book begins with his birth and his early childhood. So, but then I skip over his adolescence and I pick it up again with him as a young adult. I needed him to be a little naive as a viewpoint character for technical reasons, obviously, because he needs to be the person through whom we see this world. So he can't be too sure of his place in it, so that we can see him try to and then fail to comprehend this world. And through that, we can relate to the world as readers, right? That's the idea, like from a technical perspective. But from a bigger perspective, it's also that I wanted to play with the idea of who spent so much of his childhood being manipulated and, actively shaped, in this case by his mother. Even as a young adult, he finds himself being shaped by more or less everyone he comes into contact with, right? He's like a sponge. He soaks up whatever influences and direction anyone wants to give him. It takes him a long time to develop a kind of an independent selfhood and will and desires of his own. Like, he spends a lot of the book like not knowing what he wants. He actively wants to find out. He's trying, but he's not succeeding in his early attempts, at least. He's doing what he thinks he ought to do, which keeps changing as he learns more about the world and about himself, which I think is what growing up is like in any case, especially as a young adult, not as an adolescent, but as someone who is supposedly already an adult and is treated as an adult, but on the inside has absolutely no idea what they're doing, which I think is relatable. And it's also someone who has been told that they have grand destinies, that they are meant for things, and then had that taken away from them. And in some senses is grateful for that. That opens up space for you to find out what you actually want to do, but you don't know how to do that yet. So this book is really the process of him finding that out and finally actually growing up. It's also my way of poking fun at the idea of the chosen one. I think like in modern fantasy, it's more common to see subversions of the chosen one trope than straight retellings, because after generations of like direct use of the chosen one trope, I think we've all grown a little bored with like perfectly ordinary chosen ones. So nowadays you really have to subvert it a little bit or no one will pay attention. The idea of a subverted chosen one is not in any way new, but I wanted to focus on a specific aspect of like people who were supposed to be but are not chosen ones, and that is the damage shapes your expectations of yourself and your life, but also the marks it's left on the way you relate to the world. I think you can see that in a lot of the characters, not just Feta, but the other characters as well, who are chosen ones or ex-chosen ones, is that no matter how far they get from their origins, there's still some character traits that they can't leave behind.
Definitely. And I think in Feta's case, his childhood kind of shapes so much of his path moving forward. And I think the other characters that really intrigued me were his parents, who are both in very different ways the defining relationships in his life. And to both of them, he is not quite real, I would say. Like, they both use him in different ways. And could you tell us a bit about what shaped the Mother of Glory and Perfect and Kind, which are amazing names, by the way?
Yeah, well, I mean, they're both terrible parents. So obviously, like absolutely the worst.
Really the worst.
They're both kind of megalomaniacs, obviously in different registers. The Perfect and Kind is working on a much bigger scale. And I think Mother of Glory is also kind of a megalomaniac, but only in self-defense in a way. Like she had to become this person because of her, ex-husband, I guess you could call him, and the catastrophic impact he had on the world. But it's also left her as a very overwhelmingly domineering person. Like in her fiefdom, she is like this absolute near godlike power. And the Perfect and Kind is just like that on a much bigger scale. And they're both used to their word is law, how they want things to be is the way things are going to be. And if anybody is like, supposed to be absolutely subject to their will, it is their child, who has had the weight of all these expectations on him from the very beginning, and who is actively being indoctrinated, shaped, directed into being something, the particular kind of weapon or heir or legacy that they both want to have, which is, of course, the worst possible way to parent anyone. And I think those are fairly common traits of like self-obsessed parents everywhere. They are reflections of that, I guess, on a bigger scale.
I mean, not everybody's dad can reshape reality,
In a way, parents do reshape your reality all the time, right? Especially when you're a child. I've taken these fairly commonplace experiences and kind of expanded them beyond any reasonable measure to the point where Fetter's absurdly domineering parents affect not only his life, but the life of his entire city, his country, his region. All of this family drama is consequential on grand scales. So while for Fetter dealing with his father's plans for world domination or whatever, in a sense, like personal problems, for everyone else in the story, they're like much worse than personal problems because they're serious political issues. The people in the story actively resent Fetter for this. Like, you're fine. This is your dad. The rest of us, he's like this horrible, world-consuming political figure who has to be fought in the street kind of thing. But for you, it's your family trauma.
And I think in the book, Mother of Glory describes these invaders who, his father is part of, as essentially a cult. And, she talks about how the indigenous people had no tools to combat this kind of thing. But when you look at it, she essentially raised Fetter the same way. He is the product of a cult of one, I guess.
Yeah, and why he's a little, naive. Yeah, what you said about Mother of Glory, essentially like building a cult, like after denouncing the perfect and kind religion as a cult. That's actually true of like a lot of things. I think she even acknowledges this at one point where she says like about the devils, right? Like she didn't used to call them the devils, but now, just like everyone else, I call them devils too, right? Somebody else's language becomes your own because a lot of her worldview is inevitably and necessarily shaped by these powerful influences. And despite herself, she's taken on traits of the enemy to resist the enemy, kind of the language, the methodology, the indoctrinations, the violence, even.
Before we go any further, I'm going to say to anyone listening, if you haven't read the book, go read the book because I'm entering spoiler territory and I will not apologize. I think now that everyone is forewarned, they can go buy the book and come back.
Yes, meaningful pause while all of you go buy the book and read it.
Exactly. Coming back to his relationships, I found it quite interesting that despite his mother and father both being kind of absent from his life, and they loom very large, of course, but they're not part of his day-to-day. He's built this whole life in a different city, in a different world altogether. But at the same time, his relationship, his comings and goings, his purpose all seems very transient. He has it in him to be this community leader and to like bring people together. And he does do that to some extent. But maybe because of his upbringing, he doesn't quite understand the nuances of relationships. The relationships that he thinks are very important and permanent are actually the ones he lets go of the easiest. Was that a deliberate choice? You wanted to show that imbalance in that relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, you'll have noticed that he's also remarkable for not moving out of the immigrants district. That's like the most transient housing that he can have, right? But like, he stays with it because he finds that transience comforting, I guess, at some level. He's keeping his own life at a remove. His romantic relationship kind of, in a way, subject to like false, like in Pipra's case, this is literally true, like a false name, a false life that he's living. But even with Hedgeman, he was pretending to be somebody experimentally, trying out a version of adulthood, whereas the actual relationships are the ones with his fellow Unchosen, with Cole in particular and Kadov.
Yeah. That was what I was going to come around to next. He had a lot of faith in them. For all that they're very angry with him, they're the only ones who don't abandon him.
Yeah. He trusts them to take care of themselves because he sees them as like himself. Yeah, I think especially in those two, in Cole and Kadov, Cole in particular, he's found like a peer. he's never had peers, right? He grew up like this only child who was always very much mama's boy. If being a mama's boy meant you were, like a violent, murderous little shit. These are not like exactly healthy ways of having relationships, obviously. But maybe that would change after the end of the book, where he's actually had some personal growth.
We live in hope for poor Fetter. But I mean, coming back to the other unchosen ones, and I think it's wonderful that he has this community, because that's not the kind of thing that most chosen/unchosen ones have in these kind of situations. But I also found it interesting that in this group of outsiders, he also found a way to make himself feel like even more of an outsider.
It's very high school shit because he never had a high school, right? This is his first experience with group dynamics. So he's very bad at it. He gets better, I think, but only by making everyone mad at him and fucking over every relationship at least one time.
And I mean, I must say, these unchosen friends of his are very generous. They are like, you know what, we'll take you back. We'll hold your hand while we're basically doing this revolution. I don't know. It's very complex. But also a lot of what's happening around Fetter, the various bureaucracy, there's plagues in there, there's obviously pogroms, and it's a bit like white noise to him, and he doesn't quite understand, and he sort of skates around it, even though, I mean, he's literally witnessed mass abductions, mass executions. He himself has been placed in like a prison camp situation. And so initially I thought he was very naive and kind of innocent, but towards the end of the book, I sort of started to realize that they really were distractions. It did feel like he was living on a different plane from everyone else, and in a very real sense he was, which is kind of the kind of twist that you appreciate. It makes his evolution into someone who accepts his own powers and possibilities a lot more interesting. What do you think he's becoming?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to leave that open-ended, right? This is not the kind of book that's going to have a sequel. So there will never be a canonical answer to this. Actually, in my experience, that actually is what it's like to live through tumultuous times, right? Like, you never feel like you have like a grip on what's happening. You never feel like you entirely understand like all that's happening around you. You are, in fact, preoccupied with your own problems. Like, even as you are moving through historically significant events, you always feel kind of lost and like confused and scared, and as if, at any moment things might happen that you like out of and catch you unawares. And sometimes things do. Fetter is not immune to that. I think nearly anyone would be completely out of their depth. So in that sense, I wanted him to be a more realistic human person rather than a superheroic figure who is like, I have everything under control, trust me, kind of thing. Because he absolutely does not have anything under control. He's been beaten down quite a lot by the end. So I don't know like what or who he will become, but I guess that's why the book has this title, The Saint of Bright Nose. It's the title that his father offers him, kind of, I guess, like ironically, if the perfect and kind can be said to be capable of irony, which I'm not sure if he is. But it's kind of a violence, the offering of this title, right? And he rejects it, obviously. But at the end, you could say that he is gradually becoming a version of that's his own.
And in the end, Fetter's destiny turns out to be quite different from what he imagined. Like, all this time he's been told, you are going to be the one to end your father and your mother. And I mean, that kind of comes about, but in a way that nobody really expects. There's lots of twists in this book. I say this very honestly, I'm not always a fan of the twist, because sometimes you can see it coming a mile away. And in this particular case, I did not see it coming. I actually went back and read it a couple of times to be like, did I get this right? It was very interesting. It kind of makes you want to go back and read the book thinking, okay, now you know who is actually telling the story. It gives you a very different view of things.
Yeah, I actually hope that would be the case, that people would want to reread it.
Also, I mean, I think one of the particular treats for me is the way that Perfect and Kind dies. I laughed out loud. I'm not joking. I cackled. And it was just perfect. A very fitting ending, if you ask me.
Yes, I think he needed a proper send-off.
Truly. And before we sign off, because I've definitely kept you longer than I expected to, I have two questions. Do you think you're going to return to this world? I know you said you don't think there'll be a sequel, but do you think that you'll ever kind of play in it again?
Yes, I can actually answer that question categorically and say yes, because my second book, which is due out next year, well, let me say it's twistier than this one, but it does include, shall we say, a visit to the world of Tulduria specifically, and to this world. No characters make a reappearance, but it is recognizably the same city. And yeah, I might do that again. I'm not sure. I wasn't setting out to create a reusable world. I think I much prefer the idea of occasionally revisiting, but not making it as central. So that's what I've done in the second book, whose title I am afraid I cannot say out loud yet.
I still feel like I have gotten a scoop that there is a second book. So yay.
It's a 3-book deal. There will be a second book next year and a third one after that, all from Tor. 3 standalones, so all completely different, except the second one will definitely feature a Luriati section, shall we say.
Okay, I anticipate much twistiness. I'm very excited. I was going to ask, are you working on anything currently? But you've answered my question. You're obviously working on the second and third books.
Yeah, and the fourth, actually, because I've finished the second one like a while back. So the third I'm editing, and the fourth I'm drafting, notes for. It'll be a while before I'm actually writing. The fourth had not sold, so I have no idea when or if that is going to come out. But I will have a book a year for 3 years starting 2023.
That's incredibly exciting. That is a very cool pipeline. Congratulations.
Thank you. It is a cool pipeline.
That's wonderful. And again, for anyone listening, The Saint of Bright Rose is out in July. Don't miss it.
Thank you. And I hope you all enjoy it.
They will. And it was an absolute pleasure chatting with you, Vajra. Thank you for being a wonderful guest.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy. This is like a really good place to have my first podcast interview. I'm a big fan of the series.
You've made our day. Thank you for joining us on Arcx.
Thank you.
Arcx is a mini-series from the Subverse, the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. Follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine or visit darkandlight.com for episode details and show notes.